It's the waitingfornextyear.com podcast. On the other end of the line is our good friend Andrew. How's it going, sir?
Going good. Always happy to be on the podcast.
Yeah, so it's not that much fun. We don't have any fun topics to talk about today, but you and I will make it fun. It will be fun. We don't generally talk about world topics, but everything's hitting close to home. They canceled the MAC tournament because of COVID-19. We've talked a lot about it behind the scenes at Waiting for Next Year. Now that you've had a couple hours to digest since we last talked about it, I mean, what are you thinking now?
Yeah, so the other thing that got, I don't know if they've officially announced it, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen, is the state high school basketball tournaments are going to be limited to family only. And my high school that I went to, their girls basketball team made it to state, and they were playing their regional on Thursday. And I had a bunch of family that was coming, and I, already took off day at work, and I was pretty excited to go. And now, we don't have any family members playing, so it sounds like we won't be able to go. It's certainly pretty disappointing. But I also feel, and this is maybe not the most popular opinion right now, but I kind of understand why people are starting to sort of err on the side of caution with this. I think it's, obviously there's a longer explanation for this. I think there's some sort of mixed messaging going on. I certainly feel like, going and sitting beside my family at a state, high school girls basketball game, I feel like that's pretty low risk in the grand scheme of things. It seems kind of an interesting starting point that it's like sporting events that they're starting with, but I just feel sort of like I'm not, obviously none of us are doctors and or scientists, and we don't know exactly, just how bad this really is going to be, and, how widespread it's going to get. Still in Ohio, it's, only the 3 cases as far as I know. But I think when you're dealing with situations like this, I think it would look a lot worse or reflect a lot more poorly if they didn't do this, and then all of a sudden it found out like, oh, something was going around, and a bunch of people who went to these games, whether it's the MAC or the high school or whatever it is, all got sick from it. Then I think there would be a lot of blowback on, well, why wasn't this canceled? So I think the leaders are in a tough position here. And I don't know that anybody knows for sure what the right thing to do. I think they're just erring on the side of caution with this.
Yeah, I think they have to. I do have one friend who's a doctor, and I haven't talked to him about COVID-19, but I have talked to him just in general about what it's like to be a doctor and have people constantly ping you and ask you questions about things. And it occurred to me, like, the game theory is really simple for him. If you call him and you say something hurts really badly, no matter what it is, the only thing that he can say is you should get that checked out. And if it hurts too badly, you should consider going to the emergency room. If he says anything but that, and then you don't go and something bad happens, then he looks like an idiot. He might be liable. You might blame him. And the same thing goes for these events. Like, there's no reward for bravery for having an event and then nothing happening. But there's tons and tons of downside for having the event, and then all of a sudden it spreads to even 4, 5, 6 people. There's nothing but downside. So just assume everything that can be canceled will be canceled. And over the next 3 or 4 weeks, assuming the virulent nature of this doesn't overtake the state, they'll stop canceling things. But there's no upside. There's only downside. And so they're going to err on the side of canceling things. And I mean, I'm a man who sells insurance. So like, I mean,
Yeah.
if the MAC tournament goes on and all of a sudden there's an outbreak that can be directly tied to the MAC tournament, does that not create some liability?
Right, exactly. And that's where, as soon as I saw that this came from the governor, when the governor tweeted out that, we're asking sporting events to not do this, immediately that creates a sense of liability, right? Like
Sure.
anybody who now doesn't listen to that, and if it turns out, somebody does get sick or, passes it on to somebody who gets sick, then there's that issue of liability. They can come back and say, well, why wasn't this canceled? The governor said we should cancel it, so it sort of creates this inherent sense of liability.
Well, and just to finish in the weeds a little bit as an insurance guy, generally speaking, like terrorism, nuclear, disease, like these kinds of things are generally excluded from insurance policies because
right.
Like they insure against fire, they insure against slip and falls and injuries and these known things, but they can't insure against everything. And so ultimately, that I don't know. I'm just not surprised. By the way, I kind of made light of my little prepper list a couple weeks ago.
Right.
And I'm still not panicked. I'm prepared. I'm thinking about my own business and my friends and my kids in school and everything else. And I want to be prepared to, for what I assume is if I catch it, I'll be really, really sick for a couple of weeks. I'm preparing for that, but I'm not terrified. I wouldn't be terrified to go to a sporting event. I just, if I don't need to take the unnecessary risk, I'm not going to. And it stinks for the people who had stuff canceled. It stinks for you. It stinks for the MAC tournament folks. But if that's the worst thing that happens and this thing gets knocked out by summertime, I think will have been worth it.
Right. Like that scenario, in my opinion, is much more preferable, where we look at this, a couple months from now and we look back and we say, boy, that was really dumb that they canceled all that because it turned out it wasn't widespread in Ohio.
I'm okay with
blah,
that.
blah, blah.
And if somebody wants to call me a panicky Pete, do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I don't even think my concern isn't even so much about me getting it because, I fall in the age group where I'll probably, knock on wood, if I get it, probably be okay. My bigger concern would be the situation where I get it and before I'm symptomatic and I don't realize it and I go visit my grandma and, pass it to her and then, she's not okay. It's sort of what my concern is with it and why, and of course I don't want it anyways. Like I don't want to be sick in general. I don't want the flu. I don't want a cold. I don't want, I want to be healthy, obviously. I live in my life, like I already wash my hands a lot. I'm, not a full on germaphobe, but certainly a bit of one. I wash my hands a lot. I use hand sanitizer, all that stuff. Like,
see, for me, I came around. I didn't do any of that. I used to scoff at the people who would wipe down the shopping cart at the grocery store.
Yeah.
Like, what's the worst that happens? I'm just going to get sick. No big deal. But I've come around. I've adopted. And you're right. I don't have any grandparents left. They've all passed, but like my parents are in their 70s now. So
yeah, and so that's getting closer, to where you certainly wouldn't want them to get it. And, and even after, I don't know what the fatality rate is at right now, what it fluctuates pretty quickly because it's still so new and we don't really know. But, if it's 2%, 3%, whatever, you can say, well, that's not a very high number, but it's a high enough number that I don't want to introduce that to anybody that I care about, so, and obviously, like, the MAC tournament doesn't want to cancel or, restrict people who can come in. Same with the OSHA, they're not happy about this and they're not doing it to, for any like bad reasons or anything like that. They're just following what, the governor said. And who knows, I would assume, I would hope and assume that the governor has a lot more information on this than I do. I would hope that he's talking to proper authorities and people who have studied this and do have a lot more information on what exactly it is we're dealing with, and sort of the pros and cons, and like why it's better to try to be proactive now rather than wait until we have 20 cases of it. If we can do proper precautions and limit this to whatever the number, I mean, it doesn't matter what the exact number is, but if we can limit how many people get it in the state of Ohio, I feel like why not do it? And I understand that's not popular. I understand people make plans and they want to go to these events, and nobody likes having our lives upended. And certainly if it does get serious and we do get to the point where we have to start having like bigger issues of telling people you can't go to work, the economic side of that is pretty disastrous too. And so if we can kind of try to get ahead of this and limit sort of that economic impact on the state of Ohio, I'm all for that too. Like I just in general feel like with things like this, I much prefer sort of being safe,
So here are the biggest risks in my mind from a pragmatic standpoint. In the next 3 weeks, most Ohio schools have spring break. So Ohioans who didn't cancel their vacations, flying around the country and potentially bringing it back and then restarting school and all that kind of stuff like that.
Yep.
Those are the kinds of things that could bring new life to a situation that was otherwise under control. And so that's where government does need to step in and give guidelines. They can't ban you from traveling. They can't ban you from going to Vegas or whatever. But the idea, or at least maybe they can, I don't know. But the idea is to limit and help limit and encourage limitation.
Right.
And you hope people are being overreactionary. You really do.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's talk about the Indians.
All right.
Speaking of overreactionary, I think we're almost done. I'm in some ways I'm thankful that Francisco Lindor cut off contract talks to get the season started with, because there's really nothing left to be said unless the Indians either trade Frankie or sign him. Other than that, we should just it's the same takes over and over and over again.
Yeah, we had obviously they got a couple days of content out of Frankie and the Indians both talking to the press and saying, yeah, we still both want to get something done, and we know it's going to be hard, but we want to keep working at it because it's important. And it made everybody feel good for a couple days, but then you didn't hear anything, and it was like you just sort of felt that sit in, like that's great, and like I don't want to take it for granted them people in the Indians organization saying the right thing, because they sure haven't done a whole hell of a lot of that, to put it mildly. So I don't want to take that lightly, that it was refreshing to hear. Was it Antonetti or Chernoff? I think it was Antonetti who talked and said, look, it's very important to us to keep Frankie. We want to keep Frankie. That's our goal. I think he said, I don't normally talk about these discussions, but I'll make an exception for Frankie because that's how important he is. And that's great. And that's what I want to hear. And I want to believe that. But there are certain realities looming that are so much bigger than anything either side will say. And that's independent of even just what the Indians are comfortable going up to, whatever that number is. There's also that sort of reality that Frankie, just on the nature of who he is, his marketability, his personality, his star potential, the position he plays, playing shortstop, he is going to command a lot of money on that market, and that's out of the Indians' control, regardless of where they might feel comfortable being at, So it was always going to be an uphill battle to try to find any kind of common ground. And certainly when the Indians talk about, signing Frankie is one thing, but then we have to field a team around him and we want to still be competitive. And how do we do that if we're committing such a high percentage of our payroll to Frankie? And so you kind of can understand some of that. And I think if it was 20 other teams, I would have felt a lot more optimistic about it. But knowing what I know about the Indians and the way they do business, I just never really felt all that optimistic that something would get done now. I think if I still would say the odds are astronomical that the Indians will sign him, but if they do, I really do think it'll be one of those things where it comes down to the absolute wire and down to the last minute to get something done, because I just think there's too many other factors at play here.
It's just, it's unfortunate because this is the closest thing that you'll ever have in an Indians uniform to being comparable to LeBron in a Cavs uniform. I mean, no one baseball player can ever make the difference that LeBron can make on a basketball team. We all know that. No one baseball player can make the amount of difference that a quarterback can make in the NFL. But if there was one player in our lifetimes, you know, I would have, before Frankie turned into Frankie, I would have said Victor Martinez was the best. He never commanded this kind of market attention. Never, and was never going to. But Francisco Lindor is just different. It's just different. I don't understand how it would ever make sense for the Cleveland Indians to let him go, because it just doesn't, in my mind. And the only way that you can talk yourself into the idea that it's smart to let Francisco Lindor go is if you are deeply invested in the Dolan's cash flow, their annual finances as it pertains to cash flow, because this franchise is worth over $1 billion now. Yeah. And it's really hard to square that.
Yeah. It's hard to square when you're talking about a valuation over $1 billion. And the Indians are telling us that even before we're paying Frankie any money, that our payroll has to be under $100 million, that we have to go into a season at what are they at, 92 or something like that?
Yeah, 90 some.
You know, that I have a real hard time squaring that. And that's why, you know, Frankie threw out the number 120 million, that he thought if the Indians committed to 120 million on this payroll, that, you know, they could sign him and still field a competitive team. And I looked at it, and, you know, 120 million is still less than league average. Now, granted, league average is being inflated by a couple teams at the top. But it's still, it doesn't even have them. I think that would 120 million would have them ranked like 19th or 18th, something like that, in baseball. And my thing is with, when I look at what other markets are willing to spend, like, there's other markets similar to Cleveland that can spend more than $120 million. And so I think when you start wondering about why the Indians are balking at that, I think you're right in the terms of that's when you start to get into really caring about the Dolan's cash flow on this. And, you know, any of us can guess, you know, we don't see the books and we don't know. So to some degree, sure, there's always guesswork involved, but if, you know, Frankie Lindor is such an outlier in this. Like, if ever there was a player that you say, you know what, this is going to hurt, but we got to suck it up and sign him, like, this is that guy. And
even if it means you have to sell the team.
Yeah, fine. So, you know, I know they don't see it that way, but like, as fans, like, we were fans of the Indians before the Dolans were there. We'll be fans of them afterwards. Like, I just don't care about that kind of stuff. Like, I know I'm aware of what it sounds like when I say we'll just sign him no matter what it takes, but that's kind of how I feel. If I'm just being honest as a fan, like, I don't care about any of this other stuff. I don't care about what percentage of the payroll it would be. I want them to sign him and then find a way to make it work, whatever that entails.
So here are two things.
The fan side of me.
Here are two things for you. Number one, I hope that they at least came out of these talks knowing what it will actually take, so that they can think about it, so that they can contemplate it. They can, whatever they need to do to put it into their analysis machines to see what the future would look like. I hope they have a really, really good idea of what a yes would look like. That's number one. And I'll let you react to that, but I'll give you a second thing too. How much of the fact that the Indians haven't sold out the home opener do you think has to do with this, specifically Frankie Lindor, or is it just Dolan resentment built up over time?
So, I do think on the second point, I do think it plays a fact. Like, I think the Dolans, and maybe rightfully so. I don't love the attendance conversations, but I do understand why they might be frustrated with the fans to some degree on that in that book. Like, I think the Dolans can sit there and say, you know what, like, you look at what a mess the Browns have been, and for 20 years. I mean, just an unbelievable disaster that the Browns have been, and the fan base is rabid for them. You look at the Cavs outside of LeBron being here. The ownership of Dan Gilbert, the instability of leadership, the constant turnover in the front office, and the fans are still like. I mean, if you watch these last couple games, like, that arena is still electric for the Cavs, and I think the Dolans probably say, look, like, we've given stability. We've had a tremendous front office that everybody respects around the league. People constantly try to hire people out of this front office. We've had stability with our manager for a long time. The ownership stays out of the way of the baseball decisions and lets the baseball people make the baseball decisions. They've contended for championships. They've made the playoffs, and the fans are still not selling out the home opener. I can understand that frustration. So I want to be really clear about that. Like, I do think that probably weighs on them a little bit, but I also think, like, this has to be a bigger picture than that. Like, if you let Frankie walk, that's not going to help your case any. Like, you're not going to get fans to say, oh, well, now let's go to that home opener now that you let Frankie walk. Like, I don't think it's going to work out that way. And I think for better or for worse, whatever, I think there's been a long time feeling since the Dolans bought the team that, there's always this constant talk about how they can't afford to do anything. It just weighs on us. I mean, every conversation, even down to, Dolan saying last year about him flying coach or whatever that ridiculous conversation was. It's like they constantly are throwing it in our faces that they don't have money and that they can't fight the same battles that other teams fight and that it's harder for them than everybody else. And maybe after a while, fans just start to say, well, yeah, you know what, things are tough, and maybe I'm not going to spend my money on going to a baseball game then. Like, well, and times are tough for all of us.
Even I've turned the corner and I've been as loud and angry as anybody. Even I am not expecting them to spend $240, $250 million a year. I'm not. I'm really not. I think that every penny that they spent when they had Encarnacion on the team is totally doable in a contention window. Yep. That's all.
Yep. Well, and that's my problem with it. Like, so the Indians narrowly missed the playoffs last year. And so we know now that we're down to basically 2 years of Lindor, and their reaction this offseason has been they traded Corey Kluber, and, that's about it. They made a couple, smaller signings, but I just look at it as they're reducing payroll in a contention window. And what is that message to send? And how do you expect fans to be fired up to come, on a traditionally, it's not like traditionally we have good weather for, Cleveland home openers either. I think that's always probably going to be to some degree a weighing factor.
I think it's on March 26th this year.
Yeah. I mean, that's just insane. Right. So for that, for the fans to be fired up and excited, like, the Indians had to do something this offseason, I feel like, to tell us, like, look, we see what's going on. We understand other teams around us are making moves. Well, we're going to make a move too to get better. And I just don't think that's the message that was sent to the fans. It felt more like they traded Corey Kluber, and they said, well, we're just going to stand pat here and hope that the Twins were a mirage last year.
And I'm not saying that trading Corey Kluber was a dumb idea. I'm just saying, like, that's the lasting impression of your offseason. That you can't get excited about an exit.
And the other part of that too, though, is that they pretty much told us that they were going to use that money in other ways. And I don't feel like they really like delivered on that. Like I think we all thought that meant that they would, sign somebody that, would make an immediate impact that would be sort of tangible, that you could understand how this guy was going to add to this team. And, the signings they made were all right, but it was just kind of like filling in the edges, I guess. And, I don't know, like, I don't feel like I'm seeing a message of that we're really excited about this team and that we're going for it, that we're going to try. We got 2 years of Frankie. Let's just go for it now and see what we could do. So it's sort of like they're telling us, it almost feels like they were like setting up to sign Frankie, maybe even like, okay, well, we can't commit to all this other stuff because we want to sign Frankie. But if they would have signed Frankie in this offseason, and if they said, we had to trade Corey Kluber, but we had a lot of depth at pitching, we think we'll be all right there, and we used some of that money to help us pay for Frankie or whatever. Like, I think there would have been a lot more excitement.
Well, and that's part of it too. That's what drives me crazy is like, if you're going to have this off season, and why not have Antonetti or Chernoff or somebody from the front office come out and say, hey, look, you guys are focused on the wrong things. It's not about the money. We've got exactly the pitching staff we want. We've got the flexibility to add somebody at the trade deadline. We signed this guy. We think Franmil Reyes is going to take a step forward. We got Aaron Savali. We got all these guys that, we're lucky to have them at their current price. Don't pay attention. We got a replacement at second base. We've got every piece we need to compete 90% of the way there. And if that 10% shows up at the trade deadline, we've got all the flexibility in the world to go and add it. But they don't even say that. I could do it for them. But I don't know that they believe it because they never say it.
And I think now the feeling is almost more of, and you've seen it already in the last day.
But Andrew, would you buy it if I said that? If they said that, would you buy it?
Well, I think I would at least say, okay, let's see if they live up to that. And I would at least look for it. I just look at it as, this offseason. So we signed Cesar Hernandez and who's the other guy we signed? Oh my gosh, I can't remember the other signing, but
I can't remember either.
These moves are not the moves that tell me like, okay, that they're really like preparing to, make any of those kind of moves. And if anything, I feel like the narrative has become the Indians are closer to trading Frankie. That if the Indians aren't in contention by the trade deadline, we're going to hear his name in trade rumors again.
Domingo Santana.
Thank you. Domingo Santana.
It was going to drive me crazy till I remembered.
Yeah.
Or looked at it.
And I just, I'm really apprehensive about the fact that a scenario in which the Indians trade Francisco Lindor at the trade deadline, to me, seems just as likely as them contending for a World Series this year. And it makes it hard for me to have the same level of excitement that I did, certainly a year ago, and definitely 2 years ago, after the World Series run, so I don't know, like, I don't want to just sit here and be like, oh, I'm just really down. I'm not excited about baseball. That's not true. I'm actually pretty excited for this season in terms of, another interesting Indian season in which they do have good pitching and, if, like you said, if Framil does step up and have a huge year, and if Carlos Santana can be the same guy again, we got Frankie and Jose, if he's back to his normal form, and, if Cesar Hernandez, comes back to form, all these things that can happen. Yeah. Roberto Perez, another great year out of him. Like, all these things, like, there's definitely a scenario in which the Indians win the division and we have postseason baseball again, and that's exciting and that's great. But it's the Frankie thing is always going to be looming over us for these next 2 years, and it's not going to go away until we have some kind of conclusion to it, one way or the other. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me. How much of this, like, if the Indians are ever going to sign Frankie Lindor to a deal, they're not going to overpay in either of his arbitration years. And so this year they have him for what, like $17.5 million, I think, something like that.
Somewhere around there. I think that sounds right.
Is there any way in your mind that you can convince yourself that if they were ever going to sign him, it's going to be after they've paid him as little as possible, as long as possible?
Well, I think that's certainly possible. I still don't know how smart it is to let it get to that point. I think, you get to the point where he's talking to the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Angels, the Cardinals, the White Sox.
If they're paying him 17.5 this year, and let's say he gets a raise next year to 20, they're getting 2 years at 37. If he's expecting average annuals to be 35 million or more, they're basically getting 2 years for the price of one.
I mean, sure, but you could also look at it as you're also extending, like, how far out you're going to be paying that 35 million plus. You know
Absolutely
what I'm saying?
True.
Because you're adding those years at the end of the contract. So, you can see both sides of it, I guess. But yeah, and to be clear, like that, I think that number is going to be 35 million a year. I think that's what at minimum, that's what it's going to take to sign Frankie Lindor. And I know that's a huge number. The Indian, I don't know what's the highest number the Indians have ever paid for in a year for a guy. I don't even know. Like, what was his number?
Like 20 or 21.
Yeah, so that's a big jump to get to 35, obviously. But again, it just goes back to everything that Francisco Lindor is, and it's going to be one of the most painful things when that guy walks away from this franchise. And I'm running out of hope that it's going to end any other way than him in another uniform. And it's going to be, and he's so young too, that it's going to be yet another guy that we always will remember these great years we had him when he was young, but he's going to spend his prime on another team, and he's going to be remembered forever by everybody outside of baseball or outside of Cleveland for that other team he played for. Like Manny Ramirez is not remembered. That still bothers me about Manny. CC Sabathia is not thought of as an Indian.
No.
And maybe, actually CC Sabathia is probably the last time we were in this similar situation where, I really wanted the Indians to be able to sign him. And, it was kind of a similar situation, in which
really was.
We always had hoped that he wanted to stay, and there was some talk that he wanted to stay and that the Indians really wanted him, and, all this and that. But then as you got to the end, that, those last couple of years, it started to look pretty clear that it wasn't going to happen. And then it became inevitable that the Indians traded him.
CC handled it very much the same way, where he said, look, no offense. I want a maximum contract for whatever I can get.
Yep. And as they should, because again, you just can't tell me that the Indians can't pay Frankie Lindor. I just don't believe that.
I won't
either. They can't do it. I can certainly believe that they don't want to, or that it will be difficult for them, that it might create some problems down the line. All of that. I understand all of that, but you can't tell me that the Indians can't sign him.
I'll even believe that it might be painful in the first few years.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree.
But once you sign them to that deal and you've got it all in front of you, then you make moves. Maybe it's minority owners, maybe it's partners,
Yep.
maybe it's eyeing that new TV contract. I don't know.
Yep.
Whatever it is, though, now it's in front of you, and now you go get it. You figure it out. The attendance follows. The attendance follows. The success in the local market follows. You've got to go out and grab it. They expect people to invest first, even though we don't get any capital. We don't get any equity. And that's probably where I get most annoyed with the Dolan ownership, is that I feel like, and my family has bought season tickets since '94, and I feel like, I feel like I'm consistently being told I'm not good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little bit harder for me. Obviously, I live in Columbus, so I'm not there to go to games all the time, but I can't always speak to the exact reasons of why attendance is where it's at, and, what would need to change. But, from a big picture sort of thing, you could say, well, of all the sports, baseball is the most affordable, to go to. You can get the, even with cheap seats in a baseball stadium, you can still have a good time with family, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know the ins and outs of, all the economics of, of Cleveland and why people don't go. But I just can't get behind this idea that it's the fans' responsibility to do any of this, that this is in any way, shape, or form on the fans. That, well, we would have been able to sign Frankie if the fans would have showed up the last couple of years. I totally reject that point of view.
Me too. All right. Well, speaking of ending on a down note, let's end on a positive note. When was the last time you thought about the Browns? I don't think about them much at all right now.
No, I mean, well, obviously, with the Schobert and Kirko news these last week, maybe that, but otherwise, it was once they hired Andrew Berry, it was just kind of, for me, it was just kind of like, okay, now we're good, and I'll see you at the draft. That's kind of where I've been at with the Browns, which is, it's actually kind of refreshing, them being kind of just quiet and under the radar right now.
Yeah, it was a disaster, but they got that disaster kind of out of the way, and now there's nothing to do but wait. And I kind of enjoy this part of the Browns season.
Yeah, it's sort of nice that we don't have to worry about too much. And the draft is always kind of where we really start to ramp things up with the Browns. I'm sure we have some drama on the horizon. I fully expect the Browns to trade down with their first round pick, and everybody's going to be mad about it. And that's going to give us a good kicking off point for the year of constantly arguing about whether that was stupid or not. And I'm sure,
Although let's talk about that for a second, because I used to be team trade down. I used to love it. And now that, we don't know if Baker Mayfield is their quarterback or not, but we know that Baker Mayfield keeps them from drafting a quarterback in the top 10.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm all good with a trade down. I'm all good.
Yeah, I know. So I look at it as, we all know, everybody in football knows, the Browns are picking a offensive tackle with their first pick. I think we all know that. And this is a very deep offensive tackle draft. And so, if when pick number 10 comes up, and if the Browns say, well, okay, maybe the guy we like the best is already off the board, but 2 through 4 we feel all are pretty even, yeah, I think they will absolutely trade down. Because here's the thing, and that I've been saying to you guys behind the scenes, is I've sort of come to this realization, whereas last year I was all in on the optimism, right? Let's go for it. We're going to contend for the playoffs this year. I really believed that going into the year. This year, I sort of said, you know what? The Browns are not 1 year away, that they can't fix all of their problems in one off season. And so if they can acquire more draft picks, I think that's better for them. Big picture. Like, obviously it depends. Now, if we see a run on tackles and 3 guys go off the board before the Browns pick, then I'll feel very differently. Then it's, get the best tackle that you can right there. So, some of that we have to sort of see how it plays out. But I just look at the paper thin depth of this team, and I look at a lot of holes on that defense that it's going to take a lot of work to fill all of that. And, the offensive line is pretty much a mess. And, we don't just need 1 tackle, we need 2 tackles and probably a guard. So, that's a lot of work, a lot of players that the Browns need to acquire in this offseason. Now, some of it they can do with free agency, sure, but, it's not like the draft where you can force them to come play for you. Free agency, you got to make sure you sign the guys, and we don't know, how successful they're going to be there. So there's a lot of work that the Browns need.
Yeah, there's a ton of work. I mean, just it all depends on just how bad Freddie Kitchens was as a coach. If he was as bad as the players want you to believe, then the Browns are still a lot closer than we think, and they probably should be challenging for the playoffs this year. But that team underperformed so poorly this year, it's impossible to make any prediction whatsoever.
Yeah, like I can see a scenario in which they're a 500 football team and in the hunt for the playoffs. I
just
can
be
see
an
that.
idiot to predict it.
yeah, and I just think when you look at the linebackers where right now we're looking at starting with Mac Wilson and
Sione Takitaki.
Yeah. Mac Wilson did okay. He did pretty good, right? Filling in us, but I don't see him right now as an impact linebacker. And, when I watched these playoffs and I saw the play that all these playoff teams got out of their linebackers, like the Browns weren't in that class. And that's why, like, the Browns were in a tough situation with these linebackers. Cause like, I love Joe Schobert, right? And, I think he's a really, really good linebacker, but is he a top tier impact linebacker? I don't think so. And I think somebody will pay him like he is one. And I'm not sure it would have been smart for the Browns to be the team to overpay for him because they have so many glaring needs. Now they have cap space. They could have worked out something to sign him. And I think maybe if Kirksey hadn't had so many injury problems, I think maybe they would have tried to a little bit harder to work something out to keep him around for another year yet.
Kirksey would be a really good value signing for somebody else, but it never was going to work out with the Browns. And maybe the same thing with Schobert. Sometimes you pay because you're the incumbent. And so I expect the Browns to fill some of those things in free agency where there isn't that expectation. Well, these guys should have taken care of me and they didn't do it.
Yeah. I think I totally agree with that. And so they were in a tough situation with those guys. At corner, Denzel's good, but Greedy, the jury's out on that one yet. I don't think adding another corner would be the worst thing in the world. Safety, they need lots of help at safety. I still think they could use another edge rusher, regardless of whether they move Vernon or not. I think that, there's just a lot of things that need to be addressed on that defensive side. So, but if they can do some of that, in free agency, maybe they make a couple moves. Maybe they're able to sign some linebackers. And maybe
that's the other thing. No team is perfect. They're
right.
At least 4 players away, maybe more like 6. In a perfect world, they'd get 8. But you just can't. You're never going to be perfect. And the other thing that I keep in mind when I'm talking about these linebackers is that the entire season, the entire defense kind of turned on a dime once Myles Garrett got himself kicked out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so,
and that's a huge loss because the offenses obviously pay a lot of attention to Myles when he's out there, and that just makes life easier for everybody else. I know that's some real deep insight there, but it's true. Like
guys like Myles Garrett lead to interceptions down the field. They just do.
I mean, it's just that shifting of responsibilities, and when suddenly the number 2 rusher is now the top rusher, and now they're paying more attention to him. And then it's like everybody shifts up in the caliber of guys that they're going up against, and that matters. And so we saw that. So it'll be hopefully Miles can have a full season with us, and continue to still play hard and aggressive, and be the terror that he is without getting himself suspended for the rest of the season. You hope for that. If they hit on a couple draft picks, the Browns can be very good. I'm in no way down on the Browns. I just think, in terms of why I think them trading down is not only likely, but maybe even a pretty good move, is just because I do think the Browns have a lot of holes to fill. So
I'm with you 100%.
And I think that helps. Yeah.
All right. Last but not least, most important thing we're going to talk about today is the Deaf Heaven show going to be canceled?
It was funny because I was going to ask you that before we started the podcast, and then I forgot to mention it. But
Andrew and I are scheduled to go to a black metal show in Columbus in like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that.
Yeah, April. I don't remember the exact date, but early to mid-April. You talk about obviously we're both huge Pearl Jam fans, and Pearl Jam canceled their tour. And I was thinking about this because I was like, a Pearl Jam arena show is actually, it's pretty mild these days, right? Like, it's a big arena. A lot of people are in seats. There's not a lot of like mingling. Whereas Deaf Heaven, we're seeing in a club, and where could be a bunch of sweaty people all smushed together.
Could be some moshing.
Could definitely be some moshing. So if you were to ask me where the virus is more likely to be an issue, it would be at a Deaf Heaven show than a Pearl Jam show. But
for sure.
So it'll be interesting to see. I think a band like Deaf Heaven, though, like they probably are more keen to say like, let's just keep going until somebody tells us not to. Whereas Pearl Jam sort of has the luxury of having their career and their status. They're able to say to take more sort of a more cautious approach. And not to get too much into the weeds on this, but Pearl Jam having gone through what they went through with the Roskilde incident, where the fans were crushed to death at their show, they've always sort of tried to like really look out for their fans. That weighed so heavily on them, and it still does to this day. So it sort of makes sense that Pearl Jam would be the band to say, let's just not put our fans in any kind of risk. So I get that. Whereas I think with a band Deaf Heaven size, they may be more inclined to say, well, let's just keep going until somebody tells us we can't.
Yeah, a band like Deaf Heaven is grinding out a living. They are grinding out a living. They,
exactly.
A small club of I don't even know what this club holds, but let's say it's 500 people on average on this tour, times, $20 or $25 or whatever. After they split with the club, they're making let's say they're making 3,000 or 4,000 a night. And that's like on the high end. And then they're splitting it 4 ways amongst the band. Plus they're paying their road guys, plus they've got expenses on tour. Like
manager.
If that band, each member is making $400 or $500 a night, it seems like a lot of money, but you can only play so many nights a year. And it's just they're grinding out a living. They're not Pearl Jam.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
So anyway, that's it. Thanks so much for joining me, man. It was fun to catch up.
Yeah, definitely. Always fun.
And thanks so much for listening out there, guys. Make sure if you're hearing this, you went back and you listened to the Dairy Brothers Tribecast. They covered all of the Indian stuff, and including the Frankie stuff. That I'm just going to say it. It's the best Tribe podcast available anywhere. It's the best one.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Love the Dairy Brothers. I've listened to every episode that they've done since they started doing the podcast for us. I found myself like really missing it in the off season. We know Todd, he's been, part of the site for a long time and a longtime friend of the site. And it's nice to always hear his passion for the Indians. And Matt, he's also been a friend of the site, from afar. And, They both have really great insight. They also have a lot of knowledge, and they can talk about this a lot more eloquently and intelligently than I could tonight. So it's, I can't recommend it enough. The Dairy Brothers are awesome.
So share it with a friend. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the waitingfornextyear.com podcast.